Good evening, everybody. I'm Sadanand Dhume from the American Enterprise Institute, and it's a great pleasure to be here this evening to moderate what promises to be a great panel discussion. I'd like to start off by thanking Pratham for giving me this opportunity and for gathering this quite spectacular group of speakers, and to all of you for coming. And I'd also like to thank Citi for very kindly giving us the space in which to do this program. Now, you all have our speakers' bios over here, so in the interest of time, I will not introduce them. But just to let you know who is who, we have Arvind Sanger on the extreme left, Rakesh Mohan, Ambassador Frank Wisner, Madhav Dhar, and Pravin Krishna. So what we're going to do is keep this quite free-flowing and just have it, do this as a conversation among all of us over here. But I'm going to start out with a question that I'm sure sort of certainly something that came to my mind, and I think many of you may have thought of it too, which is that a little bit over a year ago, on May 14, 2014, as the news poured in that India was getting its first single-party majority government in 30 years, or first single-party election victory in 30 years, people were thinking different things. So what I'd like to do is go around the panel quickly and capture what were your thoughts in May 2014, when it became clear that Mr. Modi was going to be elected with a single-party majority, and what are your thoughts now? And what would you say has been the most positive thing and the most negative thing in that past year? Why don't we start with you, Arvind?
Okay, so when Mr. Modi got elected, I think the message that stuck most in my mind was less government, more governance. So my assumption from that was that this was somebody who had some similarities to a Reagan-Thatcher type of thinking in terms of restructuring the fundamental nature of government in India. And therefore, it could unlock a lot of potential for Indian growth, which had been stymied, as we all know, by over-regulation. And a year later, I think I can just quote Raghuram Rajan, who was here last week in New York and spoke at the Economic Club of New York. And his answer was, for those who were expecting Reagan on a white steed, that's not who Modi is. And frankly, that's proven to be more than true. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the expectations have not come to pass in terms of fundamental restructuring of government. Now, there has been a serious look at some of the regulatory burdens that business face. And that's a good step. Some of the, I think, over-enthusiastic application of environmental regulations, that's been fixed. So those are the positives I would take away. And continuation and building on some of the policies that the previous government had put in place, whether it was continuing with Raghuram Rajan as RBI governor, or it was building on the Aadhaar in terms of doing the Jan Dhan Yojana and the opening of bank accounts. Those were things on which Mr. Modi has built on the previous government. And then last but not the least, deregulating diesel, which again, the last government had made the hard decision in terms of increasing diesel prices monthly, and then the global collapse in prices made it easy. So I think there have been positives. The biggest disappointment, if I'm getting all the questions that Sadanand asked, would be the fact that I think that the changes have been more at the margin and have not been structural. And if one of the main challenges that India faces is to create jobs for the demographic dividend, which is 1 million jobs per month by the government's own estimate, then I think this government is, or the country is going to fall significantly short, in my opinion, in terms of all that has gone so far.
Excellent. Rakesh.
I have to first give a disclaimer, which I have to whenever I speak publicly, which is that I do represent the governments of India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka, and the IMF. But here I'm only representing myself to the extent that I can.
Is your mic working? Yeah.
Yeah. Let me start again. Is it on now?
Yes.
Okay. I have to first give a disclaimer, which I always have to whenever I speak anyway, which is that I do represent the governments of India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka, and the IMF. But today I'm representing myself, I hope, as best as I can. But nonetheless, I do represent the government in the IMF. So before coming to what I expected on May 14, 2014, I have to remind everyone that India's had a growth rate of 6% plus average for 35 years, since around 1980 or thereabouts. And note, that whole period has been without a single party government. And the growth rate, when we had single party governments, almost all the time from 1947 to 1980, average was around 3.5%. So you can decide for yourself what is good for growth. So I think that issue, I think that, yes, certain things are easier to administer if you're a single party government. Other things are not, quite frankly. In that, going in the same context, so also we had the highest ever growth rate between around 2003 to 2008-9 ever in India's history, but then so did many other countries in the world during that time. So my biggest expectation at the time of the election in 2014 was that we would get out of the previous 2-3 years slump and that policies would be taken, enacted, so that we get back to 8.5%, 9% growth for the next 20 years. And one thing, again, we need to understand is there's not that big an ask, because even if you grow at 8.5% a year for the next 20 years, 20 years from now, we will be where China is today. Yes. So in some sense, there's no choice that India has to do things which make us grow that way. I think that the government has, in the last 1 year, gone in that direction. In terms of what I would have wanted them to do, I would have wanted them to take much stronger action on the India Transport Policy Report that I did in 2014.
That's very specific.
If they had done that in terms of railways, they've done some part of it on the railways that I would have recommended, not many other parts. Same thing for roads, urban transport, etc. If they do all that, then we'll grow at 8.5%, 9% a year.
But so far, do you feel that this has been a year well spent?
I think it's been a year relatively well spent because on the economic domain, there are very few things where you can say they should not have done. Okay? And that's a very big thing. I remember when I first joined the government, when I first went as Secretary Economic Affairs Ministry of Finance in 2004, I asked one of my illustrious predecessor, Monte Ahluwalia, what do you think I should do? He says, make sure bad things are not done. That's very important, very seriously actually, that the point of my saying that we had a 6.5% growth rate for the last 35 years means that we must have been doing something right for 35 years. Yes, there were down times like 98 to 2003. There were up times 2004 to 2009 or thereabouts. Of course, that also coincided during the time that I did monetary policy for the country. So that has some relationship to the highest growth we ever had. But the point really is that, look, given this kind of base growth rate, so to speak, the important thing is make sure first you don't bring it down. Second is you have to do various positive things to take it up to 8.5, 9, but that doesn't happen automatically.
Got it. Master Wisner, we have one glass half empty, we have one glass half full. Where are you?
I'm going to leave these two glasses aside and change the subject. The two previous speakers have answered this important question: what did you think May last year? What has happened that's really taken you by surprise? And for me, while I agree with everything I've heard so far, half full, half empty on the economic front, the greatest surprise personally I've had is actually in the field of foreign affairs, foreign policy. For if you go back in your mind a year ago, I don't think it was unnatural to assume two things. One, this is a chief minister who has very little exposure to the world and no particular sense of the moves of global power. Second, that his experience with the United States was hardly felicitous. We had gone through this period of tension over his visa, and it wasn't at all clear to me that you could put the US-India relationship back on a good and solid track. On this country's side, I think there was a sense of discouragement. You couldn't get things done with India. It was good enough to travel as the president did in November 2010, but nothing really happened as a result of it. But look where we are today. It's absolutely extraordinary. On the overall situation, I have been deeply struck by the sophistication, the nuance, and the determination of the Prime Minister. He has shown an aptitude for foreign affairs that I would not have anticipated. It isn't just that he's reached out to the neighborhood, to the rest of Asia, and now even beyond, but it's more important the signal that I believe he has sent, and that is India knows that it must deal with the rising power of China. And that will be a mixture of engagement and hedging. And it is fascinating to me that he has moved to construct a set of relationships with Korea, Japan, all the way through Southeast Asia in order to be part of a balance of power. And the key has been the opening to the United States. Instead of for a second taking a deep breath and saying, you wronged me, he plunged right in. His first serious visit was to this country, which all of you remember, and Obama's visit at Republic Day. But behind those headlines, a serious deepening of strategic engagement. The Defense Secretary was in India yesterday. We are opening up defense trade and cooperation, intelligence cooperation, as we've never in the past, but it's within a framework ourselves, seeing the importance of carefully handling, managing, signaling Chinese power. And there's a coincidence of our interests that I would never have imagined a year ago would have taken place. And I think this relationship is to endure. I think it is rooted in the Prime Minister's view of the world, and I have found it even better than that, rooted now in the perceptions of the majority of Indian commentators and intellectuals as people think about India's foreign policy choices. So that was a big surprise for me.
Madhav.
Well, my very quick shorthand view is Arvind's view plus Ambassador Wisner's view divided by 2. So I agree with both of them. And also, I think the biggest disappointment has been everything that Arvind says. I mean, this hardly seems like a reformist, business-minded, growth-minded government. All the sloganeering is fantastic. Make in India is fantastic. There's nothing underneath it. You know, Swachh Bharat is fantastic. There's nothing underneath it. So the aspiration is very good. The sloganeering is very good, but aspirations is not strategy, and strategy, there's no implementation there. So I think it's been a absolute disappointment, admittedly from very high expectations, but high expectations were legitimately created both by the aspirational electorate and by him. So relative to a year ago, I think it's a huge disappointment. It's a huge positive surprise to me, is exactly what Ambassador Wisner said, I had very low expectations. This would be a sophisticated diplomat where the energies are entirely externally directed and extremely successful across the globe in varying circumstances. So as Ambassador has very clearly articulated, I totally agree, that's a huge surprise. So again, I think if you look at the administration as a company, the sales department is humming. I mean, just fantastic. The sales department is very good internally, has been fantastic externally. The product sucks. I mean, the product has not improved materially at all. In fact, what the product was, as Arvind was saying, was a lot of the previous administration had done, which has been, they've been trashed for it, but whether it was Aadhaar or right to information, a bunch of things that were done, all fantastic. They developed, I mean, there's a gang that couldn't shoot straight, so they couldn't get credit for it. The product, which is the main event, has not improved in this country. The back office has slightly improved. bureaucrats work a little harder. Everyone's terrified of this guy. So it's all good stuff. They get to work early. You can get a tea time because nobody's playing golf. That's all very good. So the back office is improved. But the whole company is just marginally better. As far as the administration's impulse to the country is concerned, I do want to make a point that that doesn't mean, so I'm very disappointed and very bullish on India at the same time, because the policy impulse that the administration has in India is plus minus 1% GDP point. Everything else is global backdrop. So here's a developing country trying to grow, but you know, it needs commodities and low credit and low cost of credit. Guess what? Huge commodity collapse, cost of credit is zero. Fantastic. Cyclically, we've had 3 years of low growth. Everything is starting to rise. Inflation is collapsing. Rates are going to follow. Doesn't matter if Rahul Gandhi was running it or Modi was running it. So 70% of the setup is either good or fantastic. But we are focusing only on the policy impulse of one man and his administration to what they can do for this country. And as Mr. Mohan was pointing out, that I have the same statistics. 6.1 is actually the average growth rate since 1980. You know, year in, year out, over long periods of time. So the marginal change in impulse of a single person has always been overestimated in India. Whether it's Sachin Tendulkar or Indira Gandhi or Amitabh Bachchan, it's always like that. You know, it's just everything is so heightened. And I'll give you a very interesting statistic. I mean, I looked at 40 different countries. India has the highest ratio of stock market volatility divided by earnings volatility, which is interesting. I mean, all stock markets are more volatile than the underlying earnings. But India is sky high, which means the actual reality in India is actually much more stable than the perception of it. And I've thought about why that is the case. One is because this is a very big country that moves slowly, changes slowly, but it needs foreign financing. So the capital flows are much more violent. So that's one. The second aspect is that this is truly, and this is one of India's great strengths, a true open economy, a free press, 100 channels, 24/7 news channels. So it's all the news all the time, good, bad, ugly, indifferent, very different from China or Brazil or anything. So all of it is out there, which creates massive reactions to the underlying reality, which is actually very stable. Third, I would say, and maybe I'm venturing out on a limb, culturally we're like that. You know, hero, villain, Raja, Praja, you know, Sita, slut. You know, there's no, you can't have like normal people in this country. I mean, Infosys is the only example I know of a bunch of guys started a business, ran it clearly as a business and moved on. Otherwise, I mean, can you name somebody besides Mukesh Ambani who runs
I think we're getting a little bit far afield here.
But same thing's happening with Modi is my point, which is that this colossus is going to ride in and suddenly save us. So that's where I'm leading to, that we tend to overestimate the power of one person to change this 5,000-year-old country. That's the point I was making.
Pravin, do you agree with this assessment?
Well,
lousy product, good sales department?
Well, let me just say, where was I May 14th? Where am I today? I think I heard MJ Akbar mention in this context that never ever in the history of the world has a couple's fantasy expectation of their first wedding night actually been matched by the reality. I'm a married man, so I'll tell you there's some truth to that. So expectations are very important. Okay? So relative to where I was, I'm not sure, frankly, that I expected there was so much more to take place than actually has. If you break it down a bit on the macroeconomic front, I think the government has done very well. Growth rates have increased, inflation is down. It was a big concern before the elections. They were obviously helped by external factors, lowering fuel prices internationally and so forth, but nevertheless, the macroeconomy is in better shape than it was before. In terms of the Indian economic structure itself, governance structure, economic structure, I would point at least to one or two things that I think were very important and that I see as potential game changers, and that were telegraphed by the Prime Minister early on. Maybe it was in one of his first speeches after the election that he mentioned that one of the things that he wanted to bring about was a sort of competitive sort of federalism, where states were relatively free to sort of implement policies, compete with each other, look and see which policies worked in which states and which didn't,
and then improve on that basis, rather than have all of this be run from the center. And on that, I would say there have been at least two things that have been done, which I did not expect would happen, and I'm happy that they have. One is the increase in terms of the share of the divisible pool from the budget that the states get. They get a 10% increase relative to 10 percentage points relative to where the numbers were previously. That's a big jump, I think. And on other things, important things like labor laws and labor law reform, which has been talked about, practically every economist has talked about the need for improving kind of labor market flexibility in India. The government appears to have encouraged states to step forward, do their own thing, and you've seen at least one or two states, I think Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan, actually go ahead and sort of start to implement things on their own in terms of greater labor market flexibility. I think that's a great sign. That's possibly a signal for other states to follow, compete, try and attract investment into their own locales. So these were things that I did not expect would happen as quickly, and they have, and I'm happy for it.
So Arvind, let me come back to you. So there's this idea that he was supposed to be the next Reagan or the Indian Reagan or the Indian Thatcher, which I think all of us now agree was a wildly unrealistic expectation. But if you step back and you say, if that was not your benchmark, right? Here you have Rakesh saying that, listen, hasn't done bad stuff, deserves points for not doing bad stuff. And Pravin pointing out that there has been sort of, quite far-reaching things in terms of devolution to the states and so on. So if your expectation was not, if your benchmark was not Reagan or Thatcher, but let's say your benchmark was Manmohan Singh, where do you land?
Well, Manmohan Singh put in place Aadhaar, whose fruits India will bear for a long time. I was not a Manmohan fan, but that's something that was structurally going to solve one of India's significant problems, which is wasteful subsidies. Manmohan Singh appointed Raghuram Rajan as his RBI governor, which has been in the short term a huge positive for India in terms of providing a backdrop. I think Madhav mentioned a right to information, which was opened up. So I think there are structural changes that outlive the
GST
credit.
For that matter.
Yeah, GST, the concept was a Congress concept. So what I'm looking for
GST
is
goes back.
what structural things is Modi, other than, again, to Madhav's point of bureaucrats showing up to work on time and having, what structural changes are we going to remember this government for, that 5 years from today we can say, you know what, that was a dramatic thing that no matter who the next government is, that is going to drive growth. Now, if they pass GST, which it'll only pass because in the past, the BJP governments objected when Congress was in power, and this would be more magnanimous if the Congress governments agreed in the state level and they passed it. If they pass it, that would be, but I'm not sure that's a Modi doing. So my point is that at the end of the day, I think one of the negatives, if I may add one point, I think the Aam Aadmi Party's success in Delhi was a huge setback to Modi's ambitions. They went from saying that pro-business is pro-poor to suddenly the debate has changed to either you're pro-business or you're pro-poor. You're either pro-private enterprise or you're pro-farmer. And BJP has lost its courage to point out that the two are not opposed to each other. And the debate has gone back to one versus the other. And I think this was partly Aam Aadmi Party, and frankly, at the end of the day, if I may be so blunt, a country gets the government it deserves. And if the people of India seem to think that there's a trade-off between the two and don't get it, and the election seemed to suggest people wanted growth, but the follow-through seems to be that there seems to be this whole belief that somehow we're screwing the farmers if we're doing some of these reforms, then India is going to continue to muddle along at whatever the 6% growth rate that we're talking about.
Rakesh, let me ask you about that. I've also noticed that you had a kind of sort of outward-looking rhetoric that you had both on the campaign trail and in the first 6 months, right? Arun Jaitley very famously said that of course I'm pro-business, and there's no contradiction between that and being pro-poor. More recently, we saw the Prime Minister give a speech in Uttar Pradesh where there was nothing about jobs. There was nothing about red carpet for investors. It seems almost as though they have shrunk away from that. Does that worry you?
Well, I think that you really have to go behind all that rhetoric. Because to some, rhetoric is important in terms of mood framing, etc., influencing people and so on. But you really need to do what the governments actually do. So, for example, it's true that GST was, the process for putting GST was done by the Congress government. Similarly, the state VAT process, which is a precursor to the GST, was started by Yashwant Sinha under the old NDA government, which was then implemented by the Congress government. And I think I would say that the current government is more effective in getting these things done. It's continuation of some sort, but it probably would have taken longer without the kind of authority that the current government has, and also without the kind of dialogue that the current government has with the state governments, because you need the state governments to approve the GST law, because there has to be a constitutional amendment. So I think that I'm very confident that GST will get done, whether it's in 4 months, 6 months, or 1 year, I don't know, but it'll get done. It might have taken much longer had this kind of government has not come. So similarly, mining laws happened. There's been much more legislative action, as you might expect, if you have a one-party majority. So there's much more action in that. Also, the actions on the auctions of the coal and the spectrum, etc. There are different form relative to the previous 3-4 years. There are much greater action-oriented activities. I would also say that I would agree with others that there isn't a sense of an overarching economic philosophy that is coming through. But nonetheless, there's one action after another. Also, I talked about transport a little flippantly earlier, but the point is that in railways, it's never been there's been no railways budget speech ever before, ever, which has not talked about specific railway lines coming in. It's a big deal that you have a railway budget speech which is only talking about the overall strategy for the railways, not saying I'll put one line here, one line there, etc., etc. That's a big deal. Similarly, announcing investment program for railways of a magnitude that's not been done for the last forever, actually, and for the next 5 years. Similarly, there's a 4 times increase in the fuel cess to finance roads. In this country, how the interstate highway system funded? Not by the private sector, 100% funded by the fuel cess in this country over the last 50 years. And so I think those are very correct things. And now I don't know yet how this will actually get implemented in terms of using those funds to accelerate the construction of roads, etc., etc. So, I think that you have to look at all of those things. Similarly, as far as business side is concerned, that even though there's still a great deal of controversy going on and uncertainty to do with some of the tax incidents on corporates, one hopes, and I think this is an important issue, that if we don't solve it in the next 6 months or so, in terms of laying to rest some of the fears of both domestic and foreign corporates, in terms of the impact of the uncertainty of the taxation system, yes, I think that'll be a big negative. Hopefully that'll get done.
Let me take that to Madhav before bringing it back to Ambassador Wisner. So you could argue that you have all these ideas that have been around forever. They were around when Ambassador Wisner was in India. India needs a GST. Auctioning of mineral rights is better. So you could sort of, but here is a government that is in fact implementing stuff that, for whatever reasons, other governments were not able to implement. Don't they deserve credit for that?
I don't think it's as digital as you're saying. I think incrementally, yeah, they're implementing some things. I mean, so was the previous administration. So I go back to the thing. I think incremental reform and incremental growth is underway in India. There'll be incremental result, and all will be well with the world. I'm just saying nothing dramatic. I mean, to the extent this evening is about Modi's marginal contribution in the last year relative to what it could have been. If that is a very cleanly defined thing, I think it's a huge disappointment.
So
because he had an amazing mandate, once in 30-year kind of mandate, and the mandate was not a Hindutva mandate. So you got an extraordinary mandate at extraordinary time in India. So you're buying a stock on the low, which is country. The electorate is saying, go, just go, deliver us. and nothing much happened.
So what would
So
have
you're
been that?
saying incrementally mineral rights were auctioned, yeah, but there
Supreme
is.
Court,
Sorry?
Supreme Court required it.
What,
Supreme
so
Court required it. So I'm
what
just saying-
would have been a big set of things that he
Oh, I think for to come out decisively that ease of doing business is going to be important, and it's not about crony capitalism. It's about truly loosening up labor laws. That labor laws actually benefit the poor, and it's anti-rich established workers. Make the case for it. Make the case for privatization. Make the case for land acquisition. I mean, that's a politician's job to sit back and say, I didn't have Rajasthan, I didn't, oh, woe is me. I mean, that's what you do. You go and make deals, you get things done. I mean, Reagan didn't have anywhere close to the mandate that Modi has. So I'm saying relative to the possibility, I don't think, I mean, all of us backtrack and now say, oh, those were realistic expectations. Why were there realistic expectations? I don't understand. So I think part of the problem is that we aim so low. Everything is bang, 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 comma, by Indian standards. Why? We had the best railway budget ever, I think. I agree with it. But we have the highest freight rates in the world and ridiculously low passenger fares. Double the passenger fares. And for the poorest people, make those 20% free. They can go free, everybody else subsidize it. I bet you it will go through. But you don't have the vision, you don't have the guts. We fall back on saying what we just said. Best railway budget ever. I agree with you. Why the heck is the railway even a ministry? Why does the government run Ashoka Hotel? We don't question it. We're just happy that there's slight incremental reform going on. Every country gets the government dessert. By the way, I am wildly bullish in India. But again, we are talking about the marginal contribution of the policy impulse over the last year. Marginal contribution is not much.
Ambassador?
Well, I'm fascinated by this exchange, and so perhaps I can come back to an earlier remark that you made when you put in sort of relief Reagan, Thatcher, and Modi. And you got me thinking about that, and I believe that's a distinction worth dwelling on for a moment. To me, the Prime Minister that I'm watching is coming through as a man who believes in the power and authority of government to lead and solve problems.
Yeah.
He is a modernizer. He is a man who is determined to improve the deliverable capacities of government. He showed it in Gujarat. You can mobilize government to get jobs done by making bureaucrats work harder, by making the functions of the state accountable, but he is not what Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were committed to the concept that markets must be the driving force in the economy. He is a man who believes his politics dictated. I'm not questioning it, but to me it's very clear that the Prime Minister we're going to see will deliver a better form of government for India, but he's not going to produce a real awakening that a market or market-driven economy would produce. That's my view.
Is that enough?
Let me add that when you get to government, there's one piece of the puzzle that continues to trouble me. And it was touched on briefly when one of you mentioned the importance he attaches to the states delivering. And Gujarat delivered. But going back to a long time ago when I was in India, Gujarat had a pretty efficient state structure.
Also has a bunch of Gujaratis.
Perhaps. Gujarat had a pretty good state structure. Maybe Maharashtra has one that's not too bad, and Andhra in its day was pretty perky. Tamil Nadu had some pretty good state structures as well. But the rest of the states, by and large, were extremely weak. Now you lay on a big chunk of additional budget responsibility on the states. I'm not sure how many will be able to deliver. There is a job out there to be done, even if you work with the Modi model of making government responsible for delivering the goods and services the nation counts on receiving.
Susan, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Although that's not my job, it's yours, but still, the expectation of Modi being Reagan Thatcher, did he ever say anything in his speeches which would have suggested that that's what he would do, or is it what people imposed on him, or people who are Reagan Thatcher fans?
So he obviously never directly said, it's not like he was campaigning in Uttar Pradesh with copy of Hayek in his hand. But he did say things like maximum governance, minimum government. He did say things like the government has no business being in business. He said things like red carpet, not red tape. So he certainly encouraged the view that he would be a far more market-friendly prime minister than we have seen so far. Though I would say, if you're asking for my view, that the jury is still out. It's year one in a 5-year term. I think it's too early to conclude that from year one we know what he's going to be like, because year one for many prime ministers has been quite different, including for Vajpayee. But I want to bring Pravin back in over here, because you wrote something in the Economic Times recently, which is in some ways the opposite of what Madhav and Arvind are saying. You're saying that Big Bang would have been a terrible idea for India, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So let me rephrase that just a bit, right? Can we come up with a set of major reforms that are both politically feasible and things that he did not do? If you put the question that way. I'm hard pressed to think of anything where I'd say it's obviously doable and that has not been done.
But
so if you look, for instance, at this kind of business friendliness, ease of doing business, improving the kind of the structure of the economy for investment, land acquisition, right? Major issue. Everybody talked about it. He's tried to do things. It's not trivial. So you don't have support in the Rajya Sabha. It's going to be held up. Deals may have to be cut, but it's not just something you just do, right? So there's a political constraint there that he's faced. If you look at labor laws, how far could you actually go imposing things from the center? It's a very big issue, very, very important. How are you going to deal with the labor unions, the political fallout? It's hugely challenging, right? So I can think of a set of things. I think they have their eye on these issues. They've talked about these issues. It appears to me that they want to put their political weight behind these issues, but it's not a simple matter of just sort of signing these things in and just having it happen. Now you might ask, is it enough? As I think you asked Ambassador Wisner. And I take the point, and it's a very good point, and I made it myself, which is we're looking at more than a third of the Indian population less than 15 years of age, a huge number that are going to join the labor force. That's a third is about 400 million people, huge number going to be joining the labor force in the coming years. The numbers that get talked about are roughly 1 million new workers per month, which is a huge number. Is the pace at which we're going to be sufficient to absorb all of these entrants into the labor market productively? My guess is no. So I agree. And so I have higher hopes than I have expectations, than I had expectations.
But let me push back on that for a second, because there are things that you can say that maybe scrapping the entire public sector, the cost would be too high. But maybe say privatizing Scooters India, one terrible company that that makes losses. I mean, they haven't moved at all on some of these things, let alone, or subsidies. Right. You could say that scrapping them is politically unfeasible, but with a single party majority, you can't even dent them?
So some of this, for example, you're seeing that on the corporates, right? So the rationalization of corporate tax structures, they're talking about scaling back subsidies, scaling back exemptions. So there's been some that's done. Fuel subsidies that are going to so dramatically affect people, especially the bottom end of the income distribution. I did not expect that they would do much with respect to that, or with fertilizer subsidies. In fact, I recall I gave an interview, it was on Bloomberg TV right after the election, and they asked me specifically this, what do you expect will happen with the subsidies? And I said nothing.
Well, it's easy to remove a subsidy when you lower prices by 3 rupees. Thank you, Shell US, nothing to do with the government. Lowering prices by 3 rupees and saying I did something courageous, it's a joke. Courageous would be where you're putting pain. In the first week, Modi gave an interview where he said people should be prepared for some pain. Zero pain delivered by Modi in any speech saying this is the pain that I want the country to take. That one speech that he gave in the first week, I was expecting something after that. Nothing came. Did he give any speech saying this is the pain that we all have to share together?
Also, there are a lot of middle grounds. Nobody, I realistically expect that the public sector should be scrapped,
Right.
nor should it. But a lot of there's some policy recommendations that I've also been involved with, which is why not put a bunch of these public sector companies into a Temasek kind of structure, where there is governance improves, so it's sort of like a halfway house, that everything is in a Temasek structure, that there's a board, which can be government-controlled board that oversees these investments. So these then become investments. Air India is an investment. It's not a ministry. So governance improves, corruption improves. So you're not privatizing. So it's a halfway house to something like that. So I'm saying, you said you can't think of, I can think of a gazillion things he could have done with the political backing. And that, frankly, it's been a year, so let's see what happens. And I'm optimistic, basically because of the way I was born, not because of anything that's happened in the last year. So maybe in the fullness of time, I just think the Indian aspiration is so high that kicking and screaming our growth rate is going to go up. So that I fundamentally believe. But again, this evening is about Modi's marginal contribution to the impulse imparted to India. So in that very technical sense, I think I'm very bearish and very bullish on India.
Let me come in for a second on Madhav's side. None of us expected the Prime Minister to privatize state-owned enterprise in India. It's too big an ask.
Vajpayee did a little bit.
But relatively small. But now let's look at the idea you've just articulated of bringing together state enterprise in a bigger structure. What if the Prime Minister had said, we are going to build infrastructure, and we're going to fund infrastructure, and we're going to create a debt market in India, and we're going to use this structure that Madhav just talked about to raise serious billions of dollars against that? Now that would have been a bold move without touching the question of public ownership. You would have addressed a huge problem, and that is the financing of Indian infrastructure and its ability to grow.
Actually, I have another question for you, which is about bringing this back to what you started about, which was foreign policy. Now, I think there's a broad consensus, not only on this panel, but out there also, that he has been a success. But arguably, he has been a success in part because people are very hopeful about his economic stewardship of India. What happens if a year from now, the conversation about reforms is downbeat? What happens to him as a global figure?
Well, there are a lot of assumptions built into that, and I tend to think the world wants a strong India. We certainly do. If Modi is not able to deliver on a full lineup of reforms, I don't think that's going to change Washington's attitude or other nations in the region. China isn't going to look at India differently. We're not going to look at India differently. Our courses are set on India emerging as a global strategic or regional strategic player. And that's literally not going to change. Now, tactically, in delivering serious cooperation, here a government that is unable to deliver, as the Manmohan Singh government was not able to deliver on defense cooperation, was unable to deliver on the nuclear matter, then governments may back off. But that won't change the strategic dimension of where India is. That won't be affected by an up and down on the reform programs that the government launches.
Rakesh?
First, just picking up on some of Frank's comments. One big innovation in the foreign policy is on the South Asia region, concentration of South Asia region. And that has not been done before. The first country visited was Bhutan. I represent Bhutan, so I was very happy that he went to Bhutan. I represent Bangladesh. He's going to Bangladesh now. He's already been to Sri Lanka. Sri Lankan president has come to India. He's been to Nepal. No other prime minister has done this. And to my mind, from the economic side also, it will take some time. This is extremely important. we are the most fragmented sub-region in the world in terms of transport, in terms of trade, and so on. So apart from being a foreign policy innovation, is going to have significant economic effects, but over a period of time. Of course, Pakistan remains, and we know the problems there, and one wishes that he would do something. Coming back to the economic spheres, I do believe that he could be much bolder on labor market reform. I can take you back to 2001, in the last India government, the 2000 budget speech 14 years ago had labor market reform in it, approved by the then Prime Minister. Then for political reasons it couldn't be carried forward, but now I believe that, I think that given the kind of mandate that he has, also the understanding in the country of the need for labor market reforms in favor of labor effectively. You can also do all kinds of grandfathering, in the sense there are only 7 million or something odd manufacturing union workers. You can grandfather all of them, and you can do labor reform for the future. And that's hugely important for manufacturing. Again, one of the big things is still only a slogan, as Madhav said, of Make in India. But you think back, previous 5 to 10 years, no one is talking about manufacturing in India. So this is a big thing. The question is still what is going to be done so that actually this Make in India, and I think one of the big things is labor reform. Land acquisition, I think there ought to be mixed views, in the sense that I would not be happy if the government can just take my property at a whim. That's not market friendly. That's not friendly to private property. So I think that all of us have to think much more carefully about land acquisition. I'm not going into the details of the particular Land Acquisition Act, but I often tell many corporates, both domestic and foreign, do you want to be nationalized easily? Answer is obviously no. But you want some guy's property to be nationalized very, very easily.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's an issue here in terms of what
point.
constitutes eminent domain. So we shouldn't just say blindly easy land acquisition. I only have one house in the world. The last thing I want is for that to be taken away from me because there's going to be some road out there, easily, right? So I'm just making a point that land acquisition is, to my mind, more complex than labor market reforms.
So I think
Finally, just one more point. Finally, I think that the beginnings made, which I mentioned earlier, on infrastructure investment are extremely important. That unless we actually succeed in stepping up public investment in infrastructure, in all roads, railways, power, telecom, etc. Telecom, of course, is all private, but public investment in particularly roads and railways, you can't get the kind of growth we're talking about. And to the extent that a significant part of the corporate sector balance sheets are stressed, with the reflection, of course, in bank balance sheets. So there is limited capacity in the system currently for private investment to come up without a kickstart from public investment.
Especially in infrastructure.
Especially infrastructure. And therefore, to my mind, that the right noises have been made in the budget, certain right allocations have been made in the budget, but again, the next 6 months to 1 year, if we don't really get going and show, because that'll also be huge demand for capital goods, etc. If you do public investment, if you do railways, huge capital goods demand and so on.
that's a perfect segue for.
So that is, to my mind, much more important than many other things, because if that gets going, the whole train starts running, to continue my interest in the railways and the trains.
But could I
That's
just
a
quickly ask
perfect-
you, the numbers that were announced in the budget for infrastructure spending relative to last year's spending, you've served in government, but did you see them as impressive figures or less than where we might have
Given the current fisc, yes.
Okay.
Okay, so that's a perfect segue, since I'm sure there are going to be many questions from the audience. Why don't we sort of quickly go around the panel and try and throw this forward? So I have a pretty simple question. If you had something on your wish list for year 2 of the Modi government that you haven't seen it accomplish in year 1, what would that be?
I would say it would have to be, and I may take a little bit of issue with Rakesh. I get that land is a emotional, touchy issue, but it's
not emotional. I'm not emotional. I'm talking about real ownership of people's property being taken away by the government. That's not emotional. I'm sorry, Arvind.
But are you telling me that a year ago, before this hurriedly put together land acquisition bill was passed, India was in a great turmoil because land acquisition was depriving people of their
I didn't
property.
say
So my point is the land acquisition bill went way beyond any reasonable, if people read the details of the kind of approvals required, or the kind of social scientists and everybody that has to approve it, is just made the whole process. US has eminent domain. Do people's properties get taken away?
But
So
the
this
US
is
doesn't do
destroy-
US does not do eminent domain to give industrialists land.
I understand. So
They
you
do
could,
not.
But the amendment that they're trying to do is not for industrial land. The
Okay.
amendment that they're trying to do is for infrastructure. So my point is that at the end of the day, the land problem has to be solved for manufacturing. If you're not able for infrastructure and manufacturing, land acquisition has become a major roadblock. You cannot solve India's growth aspirations without that. And labor, whether it is public sector or it is otherwise, you have to, again, why do people not invest in India? You know, I remember meeting with Gokul Das, one of the largest exporters of textile, and they had, I forget, 35 different factories, each of which had less than 100 workers. And they couldn't compete with China because the labor laws, the minute where they went over 100 workers, would make it, you know, impossible to fire a worker. And the textile business or anything in exports is a cyclical business. So if you don't, how are you going to get manufacturing in India? It is, again, to Madhav's point, there's been a lot of talk, but unless you take these two head on and hoping that Rajasthan doing it will somehow, you know, 3 years later, other states will do it and things will happen, the demographic dividend isn't going to wait for us to get our act together over 10 years. The demographic dividend will be gone. And therefore, the need of the hour in the next 1 year is to recognize that this demographic dividend is here now and something needs to be done about it.
By the way, in the old days, it used to be called a population problem.
That's
Right.
Bull market is
So
called demographic.
land and labor, what would be yours?
No,
On
as I
top
said
of your
earlier,
wish
that
list.
I think that labor reform is among the most important issues, which I believe can be done. As I said, I think it's less complex, I think, than land. I'm not saying you shouldn't do anything on land. I will be very
Sure.
clear on that. But I'm saying it's a more complex issue. You have to be clear on eminent domain issues.
Got
Okay? But on wish list, I have a long wish list, but I will do a generality on it. Okay?
What's the short
The
version?
generality on it is the generality on it is that a lot of problems in the government arise from lack of expertise, whether it is environmental regulations, whether it is transport, or you take just about anything, that it is because of the kind of government that we have very, very little expertise. We have also very little institutional development. And this also goes back to higher education reform, that we don't have the kind of expertise being produced by higher education institutions. So I think there's a whole slew of things that you can't accomplish by fiat. You have to develop institutions, government, quasi-government, private sector, which are able to then do all the technical skills required, whether it's environment, whether it is transport, whether it is governments. Also, for example, something hitting the newspapers the last 1 week, Maggi noodles. Right?
Yes.
It is ridiculous that suddenly everyone finds Maggi noodles are contaminated. The Maggi noodles have been around for God knows how long, right?
1982.
But you just don't have the technical capacity. And here there's a sloganeering. One state says that they have some contamination, then everyone says we're going to ban them. There has to be some system to do these things, right? You don't have the expertise. You just go by a lot of seat of the pants. So now all Maggi noodles seem to be contaminated. Disclosure, I was on the board of Nestle India for 3 years before I joined the IMF.
Ambassador, what's the
So what I mean is, only give the example, not because of Nestle, but that it's again a reflection of not having institutions which govern pollution or contamination of foodstuffs, which is very important, which are credible.
Got it.
And this just goes across the board, whether it is to do with planning, whether it is to do with transportation. Cities, you don't have expertise in actually governing cities. The Bombay Municipal Corporation does not even have one urban planner in Bombay Municipal Corporation. Okay? And nor do other cities. They don't have any urban transport expertise in the country. That's why you get Mr. Bloomberg to come and help them, which is a great idea. But the point is that, given the country of 1.2 billion, why don't you have 10,000 urban planners? Why don't you have 10,000 transport experts? You don't.
Okay, so I'm thinking maybe the wish list question was the wrong one, but just one thing on your list.
Well, if I had two things
Okay.
on my list, one that's a dream and one that's realistic. My dream would be that the Prime Minister would reach out his hand to Barack Obama and say, I accept your offer to put India on a track to joining APEC. And as soon as I do that, I would like India to be on a track to become part of the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership. I would like to see India a globally competitive economy, that this avenue would open and India would not be excluded, where I'm worried now it will be, if you see the development of a Pacific and an Atlantic set of trade relationships, and India is sitting in the middle. That's my dream. It isn't going to happen. My more practical desire comes back to the same point that Madhav made earlier, and that is I want to see Indian infrastructure grow. That's going to require money. I cannot imagine, it's impossible to imagine the development of Indian debt markets that have debt from semi-public institutions, from private institutions, and even forms of government debt, for example, municipal debt, so that you can bring foreign capital and Indian capital into a debt market. Can't understand why that's not a reasonable expectation to fuel serious infrastructure expansion.
Madhav.
Material progress on labor laws, on GST, on land acquisition, the start of some kind of privatization program, a recognition that we need to fund certain things that only the government can, as we talked about. We talked about roads, but we don't talk about education or healthcare. But here we are sitting at Pratham. One of the reasons Pratham is one of the greatest charities there is, because the government doesn't work. I mean, what would be great for government is that Pratham shouldn't need to exist, but it does, because it sucks. The education sucks. So you don't need to make steel, you need to create education. You don't need to run an airline, you need to fund healthcare for poor people. So the great bull case for India is it's a solvable problem. If you stop fertilizer subsidies, if you stop running railways, if you stop running aviation, you can actually have healthcare for poor people. You can actually have insurance for them. You can actually have education that actually works. So we don't have a Somalia problem. We don't even have a Spain problem. We have a very solvable problem, but it's misdirected, and there are political structures in place that the status quo keeps going. So that's what I wish and hope for. And to me, they're entirely all of them doable, and start to corporatize some of these ministries. And we take certain things. I mean, the fact that there's a railway budget is a joke. I mean, which country has a railway budget? I mean, we just assume there's a railway budget. I mean, it should be a company that works, that has accounts. But no, it's a railway, it's some grand entity, it's a country unto itself. But we don't question it. So,
No, we have questioned it again and again and again.
I mean, we've been between two people over drinks. I mean, no, it's not publicly questioned.
No, it is publicly questioned. 2001 Indian Railways report for the Ministry of Railways. 2014 National Transport Development Policy Committee for the Government of India.
I have served on your committees reading
No,
the same damn reports.
You've not served on my transport committee. No, all I'm saying is that these are no.
I'm not old enough to have served on your
My
transport
point is only
committee.
when you said no one. No, my point is you said no one has questioned it.
Okay.
That is wrong.
Okay.
There are some honorable exceptions who
Strike
have
that from the
questioned it.
record.
Pravin.
I'll keep it very short. Land reform, land acquisition reform, labor reforms, infrastructure. That's it.
Excellent. Now with that, I think we can throw it open. If you could, there's someone with a mic. If you could, this gentleman in the third row down here, if you could identify yourself, and if you could make sure that it's a question and not a statement, would be wonderful.
I will do that. My name is Govind Singh. My question is, Prime Minister is one man. His cabinet also has a function to perform and achieve things. Did he have enough pool of talented people to appoint in cabinet who will achieve things what he wanted to do? Aside from that, does the parliamentary system and the Rajya Sabha allows Prime Minister to appoint ministers or cabinet members from the pool of private sector.
So who would you like to who are you addressing that to?
Ambassador.
I'm not a great expert on the Indian Constitution, but I'm wholly sympathetic with the statement you're making, or at least what I assume is what lies behind that question. And that is, if you look at India's government today, it is not one of the most sterling governments that I've seen. There are several extremely talented ministers, but if you look broadly at the structure, a lot of them are newcomers and they are not people of great reputation. On the other hand, India is chock-a-block with extraordinarily talented thinking, ability to accomplish tasks from the private sector, even from the academic sector. To see them drawn into government, given ministerial berths, would be a great outcome. And the flexibility, if it takes a change in the Indian Constitution, it's one of the most flexible constitutions I've ever dealt with. It ought to be done in order to increase the pool of talent available to government.
I think the coal minister, the commerce minister, and the finance minister are all not elected. They're all Rajya Sabha members. So the idea that you cannot get competent people into government by using the Rajya Sabha route is not true. And then you had the special position created from Nandan Nilekani in the last government. So I don't think that's a valid excuse. Yeah, Manmohan Singh was never elected. So
That's right.
there's many talented need to draw from that can be brought through the Rajya Sabha route.
And outside of it, Arvind Panagaria is obviously an academic and cabinet minister now as well.
Yeah. Gentleman in the second row, right here.
Thank you for a very good review of the usual policy chestnuts.
If you could take the mic because it's being recorded, and also identify yourself. Thank you.
I'm Karvajit Singh, and thank you for a very good review of the usual policy chestnuts. I'm going to take it in a softer direction. I think the most telling statistics was that there are going to be 1 million people entering the workforce. So I don't think Modi's government or any government is going to be able to provide for them, but are we creating the mood and the, not the opportunities, but the sort of climate where these people can provide for themselves? And the second question was, going into the election, there was a lot of discussion about his pluralism credentials, and where do we stand today? Because this government will be gone in 5 years, 10 years, but the history books and the general attitudes will last for a long time. So these are kind of softer questions. Where do we stand?
Who do you want to
I'd
address?
actually probably Madhav, because he says he's bullish on India, though he's pessimistic about the policy thing. So perhaps that delta, he can explain why he feels he's bullish on India.
I mean, there are many questions rolled into one, so I'm not sure I'll remember them all. Let me start with the softer side. I think that's been a big disappointment as well. I think it's been all Hindutva and no reform. I mean, I'm exaggerating to make a point, but largely I think the last year has been that there's been very little bold statements on the reform side, but the crazies in the government saying absolutely nutty things, whether they're burning churches or banning beef or miniskirts or bars. I mean, that gets a lot of airplay. I have to say, Indian media being what it is, exaggerates that massively. But if you talk to a lot of people, I think there is no question there is a little unease. I would go so far as saying that the Aam Aadmi Party's resounding win was, I think, more about a pushback to the BJP and Modi onslaught as it was a love affair with Kejriwal. So can't prove it to you, that's my sense of things. I think in terms of economic question, whether in the end it's about GDP growth. I mean, I think if we can get to 7%, 8% growth rates, I think that will create absorption capacity for people coming into the workforce. To me, I mean, this is again not an exact science. We have an expert sitting in the audience. We'll pick on him later. But my number is 7.5%, 8% gets there. I'm very bullish, to the last part of your question, for very different reasons. And the reasons are, the greatest thing that India has going for it is it's a very poor country. That's our greatest asset. So we're starting from a very low base. So growth rates look very good, and this comparison with China is bogus. I mean, that race was finished long time ago, so that's not the issue. So we're starting from a very low base effect, and if you look at what constitutes GDP, because in the end that's what matters. GDP is nothing except changes in workforce, time changes in productivity. If you look at those things, they're actually very good for India. Change in workforce actually looks very good. Change in productivities, villages are becoming towns, towns are becoming city, that adds to productivity. Manual becoming automated, that's very good. Financial inclusion, which is access to credit, is an exponential curve. Most importantly, internet penetration, broadband is an exponential curve. Aadhaar, I think, will single-handedly probably add half a percentage point to GDP and take a half percentage point out of inflation. GST will do almost the same thing. Whether Rahul Gandhi wades in and out, Modi wades in and out, this is the season. This is what the climate is telling you. I put that in my cigarette and smoke it. Out comes roughly 8% GDP. If Mr. Modi does the things we're talking about, that gets you to 9.5% GDP. So at 8, I think India will be at 8% GDP in a year and a half, and the market will be up. I'm very bullish. There'll be fewer people, poor people in my miserable country. I'll be very happy. I'm very frustrated because it could be 9.5% growth, and there was a real possibilities. Not this retrospective or those were unrealistic expectations. No, they weren't. They were very realistic expectations. 300, God knows how many people voted violently for those expectations. We've been let down. Let's call it the way it is. I mean, so as I said, it's a global factor, it's a local factor, and a policy impulse. Global factors are fantastic, credit and commodities. Local factors are cyclically turning up, technology, finance, everything I mentioned. The policy impulse, sort of neutral, big deal, all works.
Is there anyone towards lady over there at the back? Right.
Hi, my name is Deenat Nazir. My question is to anyone in the panel who cares to address it. And it's one on numbers. Over the last couple of quarters, we've been seeing a fairly robust GDP number coming out. At the same time, we're seeing fairly abysmal, industrial output numbers coming out. We're seeing that energy use is pretty low, and a lot of facilities have been offline, given that this is the peak of summer. What I want to know from you is this purely statistical engineering, or is there actual sort of sign of revival on the ground? And if that is so, how much of it is sort of attributable to Modi?
That's a great question. I'm going to pass it to Rakesh Mohan because we were discussing it in the cab on the way over.
I thought Arvind wanted to answer
We can both answer it.
Well, go ahead, you go
No,
first.
you go.
Well, I would just say this quarter, the earnings of the Indian corporates, at the end of the day, the fastest growing part of the economy is the private sector, right? So the Indian corporates this quarter so far have reported -1%, give or take, excluding energy, revenue growth top line, and have shown some double-digit profit declines. If that constitutes 7.5% GDP growth, then God help us, because there's no way that the two statistics match up.
I think that the data described by Arvind are about right. And that indeed is the puzzle that is concerning many people at present.
You need to speak up a bit.
I'm speaking as
Yeah. A little bit louder.
the data that the numbers that Arvind gave are about right. That we do not observe an increase in private investment. Both top line and bottom line growth has not been good. Partly due to global conditions, exports have also come down. So there is a dissonance between the GDP growth numbers that the CSO is providing and some of these corporate numbers. However, there isn't statistical engineering in the sense someone sitting there and trying to increase the growth rate. There has been a change in the computation of the GDP growth. All kinds of people, including I presume the CSO, are looking at it, trying to give a better explanation of what these numbers mean. But at present, I would share your puzzlement on the dissonance between the corporate numbers and the GDP numbers. If there are any press here, I would not like to be quoted on that.
I would guess if you were looking at the corporate profitability as an index, GDP growth in the March quarter should have been somewhere around 5.5%, given any historical comparison.
And if you were to just subtract that 2.2% that was added, that's where you'd come.
That's right. So that unfortunately is a very slow growth.
Lady right here in the front. Could you wait for the mic, please?
We talked about education and healthcare as being priorities that may not be getting the right level of focus or public focus. What about population control? I mean, that is one of, we may have the demographic dividend, but the population cannot grow the way and the rate it has. And I haven't heard enough of mention about that, either from this panel or from the government. I mean, this is scary,
I was just
very
telling
scary.
Saranand this, there's one scary demographic statistic that nobody talks about. 25 to 27% of men in India for the next 40 years will not find brides. That is the scariest statistic that nobody focuses on. Think about it, 27% of men, if you think violence against women is about culture, wait till you have frustrated 25, 30-year-olds that cannot find brides thanks to the demographic dividend of sex-selective abortions that have gone on for the last 30 years. That's going to be a tragedy that when you have no jobs and no wives, what is that going to do to social stability in India? We've talked about 6.5% or 6% growth in the last 30 years. We did not have this challenge. This is a challenge that no society in history has ever faced. You've had shortage of men after wars, but you've never had shortage of women of the magnitude that you've had now. So China is facing it now, but their working age population is no longer growing, so their challenge is easier in terms of at least getting them jobs, even if they can't get them wives. In India, the challenge is you have to get them at least one thing. You can't get them wives because that's already been destroyed. So then that challenge, I think, is one that is a scary statistic, which it is too late to fix.
Surjit Bhalla here in the second row. Mike's coming to you.
Hi. I'll violate your dictum of asking questions. What I would like to do is instead just illustrate a few facts. And this has to do, as you know, with my column, No Proof Required. So I have to keep up with that tradition. And the facts have to do with several things. So
as long as you promise to plug Pratham in the next one.
Yeah. That I've already plugged various other times. But no, seriously, I think, and I'll manage to alienate everybody, disagree with everybody, and I'll manage to agree with everybody. So this is an art. First, on the most recent one, this thing about the sex ratio as well as marriage, the numbers are closer to 10%, and the norm in all societies is 5%. We can debate it some other time. The second, on the population growth problem, the fertility rate in India, the total fertility rate in India is now 2.1, which is replacement level. Population is no longer a problem. Then we come to some other facts that have been asserted. If you will, one fact which has not been asserted is that textile production in Bangladesh is now greater than that in India. We have a genuine problem as to the way we've handled stuff in the past. Then with land acquisition, actually, this is the best kept secret of the Indian government and, if you will, of the Congress government. As some of you may know, but most of the people that I've talked to do not know, that the reason the land acquisition bill was not passed, if you will, and I'll labor that a little bit, was that it was not admitted into the Rajya Sabha. The bill was not admitted into the Rajya Sabha because the Rajya Sabha has a convention, that is to say that anybody, it's by consensus, the Business Advisory Council of the Rajya Sabha will only vote on consensus. So therefore, the Congress blocked the admission of the bill into the Rajya Sabha. Fortunately, they can only do it for 6 months. So therefore, when it is introduced into the Rajya Sabha, it didn't have to do with the fact that the BJP was not pushing it. It had nothing to do with it. It had to do with, artfully, the Congress and its media is, if you will, playing up the act that this had to do with farmer suicides. Simple. It will be admitted by 6 months. They cannot delay it beyond 6 months. And then there will be if the Congress is able to defeat it, there will be a joint session of Congress, joint session of Parliament, in which case it will pass because the votes are there. Then we come to the other thing, which I'm afraid my friend, Rakesh and I are neighbors. We have houses in the same locality. I also have only one house. And the market price, I will be quite willing to sell my house at twice the market price. And even if it is the registered price, it still is about 50 to 60% higher than the market price. That's what the land acquisition bill has. It does not have that basically they'll come and take away the land. So which is a huge, huge improvement over that. And I'm quite publicly willing to sell my land, if you will, at twice the market price. And I'm a neighbor of Rakesh. Then we have
Surjit, we can't have you go through the whole panel because other people have questions
One
too.
last thing on inflation. It's absolutely a falsehood to say that the inflation has fallen because of oil price falling. You can look at the data. Oil price started falling in late September. Look at the data for the first 8 months, and then look at the data for the last 4 months. This was an active policy of the BJP government to try and bring food prices down, in which they succeeded. Let us give them credit where it is due.
Well, let's just take the last question.
That's true.
Gentleman right at the back. If you could identify yourself, and I hope this is a question.
This question is for Ambassador Wisner. Ambassador, you've recently taken up the role of advisor to the Telangana government. Is that a fact, or is it just been reported in the media? Let me assume it's a fact, if not a former role, maybe an informal role. I happen to be from Hyderabad, and while I had mixed feelings with the division of the state, it's a fait accompli. So the question is, what can the youngest state in the country do differently than the other states so that it can set up a shining example for the rest of the country and make sure the federal system in a young democracy like India succeeds?
First of all,
to answer the first part of your question, we were recently visited by the Chief Minister's son, who's a member of his cabinet, and he was very flattering to me, remembered my passion for the city of Hyderabad, and he said, would I be prepared to serve as an honorary ambassador for the new state of Telangana? And of course I agreed it would be a great honor. And I'm not sure what my duties are, but I'm happy to carry them out. Second, I have been really impressed, and my interest in Hyderabad springs from what I've seen, the development of infrastructure, the educational establishments, the quality of the government structures of the state. What I really hope will happen is that the separation, now that that's inevitable, between Telangana and Andhra take place quickly without adversarial consequences. The division of spoils moves quickly, and the progress that both elements of the erstwhile state can continue into the future, and that the people of that area will benefit from this political decision to divide the state.
Thank you. Well, with that, I think we're out of time, but please stay in your seats because I believe that there is a word about Pratham, but I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of our panelists. I think this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you very much. Just stay seated for 2 minutes.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be very quick. I first want to thank the panel, Madhav, Dhar, and Sadhanand. You did a terrific job moderating. Pravin, thanks very much for your comments. Rakesh, Mohan, thanks also for coming down and being with us. And Arvind, Sangha, terrific performance. Ambassador Wisner, your all-round knowledge of India is really remarkable. Thanks a lot for being with us. Of course, I want to thank all of you for being here with us. your presence is not only important for a panel discussion like this and to make the panel discussion more interesting, but it also shows your interest and support for Pratham, and I thank you very much for that. I'll take just 1 minute to very quickly remind those of you who may or may not know about Pratham that we're doing very well. The year 2014, 2015 has been very successful, and the coming year is also going to be very successful. Our Read India program, which approaches underprivileged kids and helps them improve learning outcomes, is growing extremely rapidly. We'll touch 8 million children from the underprivileged classes in India this year, working closely with the government. Our vocational training program is also growing very rapidly. This year we'll have 25,000 trainees in the hospitality industry, in auto repair, in construction, and bedside assistance. Of those 25,000, 90%, a full 90% will be placed in jobs. And so that is a program that's doing extremely well. Finally, I'd like to say that our fundraising efforts around the world are doing extremely well. A few years ago, we were raising about $14 million, most of which came from the United States. This year, we'll raise close to $27 million, and most of that is now coming from India due to the CSR programs there. But I gave those numbers, and now I'm scared that you'll stop giving. I don't want you to stop giving, because in fact, we have many more million children and youth to cater to. I'd also like to tell you that we're a low-cost, frugal organization. The wine you got outside, we didn't pay for. It was donated, and so was the food. So we do things really at very low costs. Most of your money goes to the operations of Pratham in India. Finally, we have our Pratham annual gala coming up on the 16th of October at the Waldorf Astoria, and I can promise you it'll be a wonderful evening, and I hope all of you will be there, and we look forward to seeing you. Thank you once again for being here and for supporting Pratham. All the best to you.